This incident occurred a few months ago in December. My boyfriend and I had traveled to Seattle to meet up with a few of our close friends to go to a local show. We had a great time catching up with our friends and dancing at the show. When the show was over, we said our goodbyes and hopped in the car in pursuit of food. We just wanted something quick, but the only places open were sit-down restaurants, and there weren't any drive-thrus in the area of the city we were in. So, we decided to make a quick stop at Safeway. We pulled into the nearly empty parking lot and wandered into the store. We got a couple of ready-made sandwiches and a bag of chips and went back to the car to sit inside and eat before we traveled back home. As we got back in the car, I noticed a car had pulled into a spot directly across from us. They still had their headlights on, and I could see two men inside. They might have just pulled in and were going to get out any minute and go into the store. At this point, my boyfriend and I started wolfing down our sandwiches, focused on eating our food and aimlessly chatting. I noticed the men were still in the car in front of us with their headlights on. I thought it was rude of them to just sit there with their lights on point right at us. I was joking with my boyfriend that we should flash our headlights at them when I looked up and noticed the man in the driver's seat across from us was staring intently at me. I looked at him, looked away for a brief moment, and then looked back. He was still staring. I felt a little creeped out, but didn't think too much of it. I went back to eating my sandwich, but watched the man out of the corner of my eye. He kept staring at me, which made me uncomfortable, so I started telling my boyfriend we should leave. When I noticed the man was holding something up, as I looked closer, I realized he was holding his phone with the screen pointed toward me, and graphic pornography was playing across the screen. He had this wide grin on his face as he held the phone up for me to see. The grin on his face was what startled me the most. The grin in conjunction with the porn shook me inside, and I must have had a disgusted look on my face because he started laughing. He put the phone down and said something to his friend in the car. At this point, I was telling my boyfriend to start the car and leave. I don't think he saw the exchange go on between the creepy driver and me, and was confused by the sudden concern in my voice. He started the car and was starting to reverse when I saw the driver of the car holding up the phone with different porn playing on it, and the grin on his face had widened, looking almost evil. I don't know why that shook me up as bad as it did. I ended up crying for a bit. I felt a little violated, like my personal space had been invaded, even though we were in separate cars. This happened on December 21, 2016. I am a 21-year-old Canadian girl, 19 at the time. At this point in my life, I was pretty desperate for attention and went on a lot of bad dates, putting myself in many bad situations. So, when this pretty cute guy started hitting on me, I was flattered, and I agreed to go do some mushrooms at his place to get to know each other better. I won't go into details, but let's just say that was a really bad idea. I ended up leaving his place around midnight, high as heck, with a long and cold walk to the train station ahead of me. It didn't bother me, though, to be honest. I was happy to be out of that situation and on my way home. I also really enjoy the cold and had done mushrooms many times by this point and was enjoying the walk. It was just a straight walk, mostly through residential streets until you came to a busier street that led to downtown. It separates the residential streets from the mall where I worked at the time and a Wendy's that was closer to the lights where I had to cross. Just beyond the mall is the train station, and you have to walk either through the mall parking lot or through a field where the old high school used to be to get to the train station. So, I got to the lights and was waiting to cross. However, it was quite late, and the light was taking what felt like forever to change. That's when a big blue pickup truck came driving down the road away from downtown. It slowed right down as it passed me before speeding off. I probably should have sensed some danger, but my high self was worried that he slowed down to let me pass, and when I didn't, he left, making me think that the light wasn't going to change. I then noticed that the same blue truck had pulled around the block and was now sitting in the parking lot of the closed Wendy's. Now I realized that something was wrong. The light finally changed, and I walked across the street. I planned on just walking past it and going through the mall parking lot to get to the train. I kept my head down as I walked. The man in the truck yelled something at me as I walked past. I looked up, and in my state, I thought it was a regular customer of mine as I worked at that mall. I raised my arms in the air like, "You got me." But as I approached the truck, I realized how wrong I was. This was a completely different person, and I was now at the side of his truck in an abandoned Wendy's parking lot. I just stared at him. I could feel someone staring at me from the back seat of the truck, right behind the driver's seat, but there was no one in the front passenger seat. The driver smiled and asked me things straight out of a PSA, things like, "What part of the city do you live in? And do you live alone?" I was being polite and answering his questions truthfully because, for some reason, I thought he was a cop. I mean, that had to be why his questions were so forward, right? He knew I was high and was trying to make sure I got home safe, right? Wrong. In a matter of maybe 5 minutes, he knew what part of the city I lived in, that I lived with my dad, and that I planned on taking the train home. It wasn't until he straight up asked for directions to my house that I played dumb and said that I didn't know. He kind of raised his eyebrow at me and said, "So you don't know where you live?" I kind of laughed and was like, "Nope, I guess not." And I walked around the back of his truck, headed for the field to get to the train station, and he pulled away. I had to cross a small street to get to the field. I noticed further down the street was the truck parked facing me, and I looked at it. It inched forward a little to make it seem like was leaving. I turned around and kept walking. I turned around a few seconds later to see the truck still there. I put my arms in the air and yelled, "I see you." He then drove off as if he was going to circle the mall. I ran into the field and pulled out my phone. I dialed 911 and paused before pressing the call. I was high on drugs, and there was a good chance that I wouldn't be taken seriously. I was also worried that I was going to have to take the cops back to that guy's house, as it had been where I left and where I got the drugs from. So, instead, I called my dad. By the time he picked up the phone, I was crying. I explained to him what was happening, and he said to get somewhere safe and call a cab. If I had been smart, I would have taken the train a couple of stops in the wrong direction and then called the cab. I didn't. I instead went to the train station that he knew I was going to be at and called the cab. I waited there for 20 minutes. I kept peeking out to see if he was there, but I didn't see him. My cab arrived, and I got in and told the cab where to go. I was looking behind us the whole time. Just before we made it downtown, I noticed that a large truck was behind us. But I couldn't see the color until we turned, and the truck turned behind us. It was, of course, blue. I started freaking out and begged for the cab to pull over. He did so reluctantly, and the blue truck slowly rolled by, and then turned the corner like he was going to drive back around the block. I yelled at the driver to start going again, and he did so, very annoyed. I finally did make it home and collapsed on my bed in tears. I didn't leave the house for 2 days, terrified that he was driving around my neighborhood looking for me. I did see him in his truck one more time, but it's not worth mentioning. Please be safe, people. There were so many things I could have done to prevent this from happening, but I was too high and dumb to think straight. Before I begin, I am going to say that I am a 19-year-old man working a full-time job. I have since moved out of the place where this incident occurred. What happened took place when I was about 6 years old. I lived in a decent neighborhood. We did have the occasional creepy person who would walk or bike by, and we also had some apartment buildings where the people living there were heavily into drugs, but they didn't bother anyone. They were nice people to talk to, and frequently mentioned they were into that stuff. They never bothered me, so I didn't care. Now, enough with the background. The house I lived in at that point was a very decent size. My dad also built a huge garage. Now, this is where what happened occurred. The garage was huge. It had enough space for 3 vehicles and rafters on the ceiling for storage of seasonal stuff, Halloween, Christmas, etc. This took place in December. I live in Atlantic Canada, and in Atlantic Canada, we get some pretty nasty snowstorms and blizzards. On a day in December, I was a little kid in the snow, and my dad was working in the garage on one of his car projects. He had gotten thirsty and went into the house to get a drink. He came back out and asked if I had gone into the garage. I asked why, and he said there were footprints in the snow leading into the garage that he didn't think was his. I said no, and we both thought nothing of it. That evening, my dad and I went to bed early. My mom worked late and came home late that night and saw some of my toys that were in the rafters stored away were on the garage floor. She thought nothing of it, moved them, parked the vehicle in the garage, closed the garage door, went into the house, watched some TV, and went to bed. Now, my dad wakes up at 4:00 a.m. every morning to be at work at 5:00 a.m. He wakes everyone up and goes out to the garage, comes back in, and is freaking out about a lot of very expensive equipment being missing. We called the cops. The outside lights were flicked on, and we saw those same mysterious footprints leading to the garage earlier, leading into the backyard and the forestry behind my house. The cops searched the garage, and my mom brought up the toys falling from the rafters. The cops asked to borrow a ladder and went up to check. They found a gun, a meat cleaver, and 3 condoms, 2 of which were used assuming he masturbated into them. I did not sleep for a week. I was terrified. They caught the guy 2 weeks later, trying to sell all of my dad's equipment at a pawn shop. He confessed to everything. He said he broke into other houses on our street. He also stated he watched our house for a whole month to learn all of our routines so he wouldn't get caught. He had the weapons in case he did. He said he jerked off into the condoms when he saw my mom. He is currently serving a 15-year prison sentence. I don't want to know what would have happened if my mom, dad, or I had seen him.